Rightio. Another live stream. This time something a little bit different. Not talking as much about one film in particular or a trailer for an upcoming film. I'm talking about a few different films, but the films with a theme, as you could probably already guess. The prequel. Why have I explored prequels? Well, my decision to do that is because there's something particular when it comes to prequels that occur in storytelling, and also there's an obsession with I say Hollywood, like the mainstream media, to explore prequels, in particular a lot more so sometimes than a sequel. Something that would just occur chronologically after the original story, whether it's a movie or a TV show or anything. Um, Something that I very much believe has arisen. Not that they've ever only done prequels since this, but there's definitely been a massive, I would say, increase in a desire to do prequels ever since the first one that I want to talk about, which is in fact three films at once because it's a trilogy. That trilogy, in fact, being the Star Wars prequel trilogy. This trilogy is quite a weirdly particular sort of. I just count them as, I talk about them as one thing because it's really just one story. The Star Wars prequel trilogy is quite a interesting prequel story. I'll call it, just episode 1 to 3 being the one story that I'm talking about. The reason I say that is because when you look at an original story, it is what it is. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it ends someplace. And then you go, okay, what's going to happen with the story after that? That's where a sequel has an uncertainty with and I'm going to talk about this throughout the whole video about the dramatic tension, the uncertainty of what can occur to characters. What can become of them. Where do they end up at the end of that story? Do they live? Do they die? And also, even if they are alive, in what condition are they alive, or where do they go? They might depart the location that the story occurs in, or generally occurs in. If it's a recurring franchise, or if it's a first film that becomes a franchise. What condition or state are the characters left in? And the Star Wars prequel trilogy is an interesting, I would say, one in terms of, I'll give it, like, as much as I actually do like the Star Wars prequel trilogy. I love the original trilogy. I really like the prequel trilogy because I'm born in 1989, so I was 10 years old when The Phantom Menace came out, which was 1999. Attack of the Clones came out in 2002. Revenge of the Sith came out in 2005. So I wasn't exactly watching it through necessarily this lens when I watched it at the age that they came out. And kids that discover the Star Wars movies, when they watch, if you're a kid watching them, you're not always thinking about them in these ways, but some people do. Even because it's just even a subconscious thing. It's not something, this is something I'm going to get into, is that it's the subconscious sort of knowing where the movie's going to end up, knowing how the story's going to end up based upon just little bits of information that you're going into this story with because of how the previous story worked out, which in this case, the previous story being actually occurring after this story, because we're talking about prequels. And with the prequel trilogy of Star Wars, we're following specific characters that are actually in the original trilogy. Thus, right from the get-go, we know these characters are going to survive this trilogy. And we know that at least one of those characters, for example, in the prequel trilogy of Star Wars, Anakin Skywalker becomes Darth Vader. So at some point across this trilogy, obviously we're going to guess towards the end of it, which is what happens, because they're not going to do it in the first movie or the second one. You've got to stretch this out, If it's going to be 3 movies, it's going to be the third one where he becomes Darth Vader, that he's going to be imparted with those injuries that Darth Vader has. So we go into this trilogy right from the beginning of knowing these characters are going to live, these characters are going to die at something, Anakin Skywalker, for example, he doesn't die until Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. Obi-Wan Kenobi doesn't die until Episode 4, A New Hope. Those are 2 of the 3 main characters. The only character that has somewhat of a sort of dramatic tension around them is the character of Padme Amidala, which is, right from the get-go, it's quite clearly established by the way she dresses, like with her hair and especially once you get to the episode 2 of the fact that Anakin and her are having a romantic affair with each other, that she's quite clearly going to be Luke and Leia's mother. So you know that she's not going to survive. And it just more becomes, okay, well, is she going to survive the first one? Well, Luke and Leia have to be born first before she can die. So she's got plot immunity up until that point. And that's a word, that's two words. It's a phrase I'm going to use a bit in this video, potentially, is plot immunity. Because that's what these characters in these prequels have when they're characters from the original story, is they have plot immunity. And she has plot immunity up until the point of Luke and Leia being born. And she literally kind of has right up to that point because she dies in childbirth. So once the second kid's popped out, boom, she's gone. But Anakin and Obi-Wan, they have plot immunity throughout the whole trilogy of the prequels. So as far as dramatic tension goes, there's not a lot that you can do with them. And yet the funny thing is, in these movies, almost like 99%, because they're the three main characters we're following, 99% of all the dramatic tension of in an action scene of is this person going to live or die? Are they going to live? Are they going to die? What's going to happen? Is all resting on the shoulders of these characters. Which, if you're thinking about it even remotely, you're like, they're in the other ones. They're not going to die. So there's no tension as to what's going on. So that's just completely shelved and gone. That's an element that normally a movie has, whether it's whether it's a standalone movie, whether it's a movie that's the first of what is someone's already intending to be a franchise, like, a Star Wars in the original trilogy of Star Wars, where it's like, well, this is the first one, but he wants to do more. Okay, but who's going to live and who's going to die? We don't know. Okay, this is the second one, Empire Strikes Back. Who's going to live and who's going to die? We don't know. And then even Return of the Jedi, who's going to live and who's going to die? We don't really know. You can sort of guess, okay, maybe they want to have certain characters, maybe Luke Skywalker isn't going to die, but you never really know, and he actually does die in the sequel trilogy. For better or for worse, however we can, talk about that trilogy, I'm not a huge fan of it. But even still, he can get killed off. We're moving forwards in time, and you don't know what's going to happen. But with a prequel story, in this case the trilogy, these characters have this immunity of just needing to be in these other stories. So there's just this element that stories normally have that's completely gone from these stories because of this narrative hurdle that they haven't really thought about. The answer to this, I would have thought, would have been to have had the characters be present in the story but be following other characters that weren't in the original trilogy. And there comes the other thing of, well, if they're not if these new characters that aren't in the original trilogy that we're following, do they die, or are they just not present in the original trilogy? You don't know, but at least there's uncertainty as to what happens with these characters. But because they're not doing that, and because they only follow solely that they put all the, as I said, dramatic tension on characters that we already know the fates of, it's a sure done thing of what's going to become of them. And thus, just a lot of drama is removed and just devoid. As much as I enjoy those films, because they are at least a planned out story of beginning, middle to end. As I say, with even the original trilogy, it's a beginning, middle, and end, which the sequel trilogy was lacking. But yeah, so, and I feel like, especially since these three films have come about, there's been a desire through, especially mainstream Hollywood, people and filmmakers in general, but especially mainstream Hollywood, because they're the moneymaker core component of filmmaking. They have definitely ramped up this desire to do prequels. Not that the Star Wars prequel trilogy are the first prequels to ever be done, but they've definitely created this element in what I would call Hollywood to try and bang out prequels as if that's somehow a money-making component just by making it a prequel. But then they don't think about these types of narrative hurdles. Other ones that I'm going to go into, where the next one that I want to talk about, the next film, which is only one film, it's not a trilogy, it's just a singular one, is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning. Now, in 2003, there was a remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that came out that starred Jessica Biel, and that's the one that had Ali Ermey as the sheriff, and he was sort of playing Sheriff Hartman, I think it was, or something. I think that was the character's name. It was the sheriff, though. and he was quite great in that role, and it was sort of harkened back to that Full Metal Jacket character in certain ways, like a certain feeling that came out of him. Not like it was just a rip-off, but it got that great Ali Ermey attitude out there. And so, being that that movie, I guess, was successful enough, they thought, we want to do another one. And so it came out in 2003, which was right in that sort of a year, bang in the middle time of the prequel trilogy of Star Wars. It came out a year after Attack of the Clones. And so, by the time this movie came along, Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning, it's 2006. So that's a year after Revenge of the Sith. Now, here comes what I would say is one of the worst prequels in terms of it being a prequel. Not just talking about it as a movie, like, effects or acting or anything like that, but just the story of it being a prequel. How does it weigh as being a prequel? Now, as much grief as I sort of even elaborated upon the Star Wars prequel trilogy as being a prequel, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning, I feel, puts itself at the prequel nature of it, corners it and boxes its story in a lot worse than the Star Wars prequel trilogy ever did. The reason being for that is that in the 2003 Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which this one is being the prequel to, the bad guy characters, the crazy family with which Leatherface, the chainsaw wielding maniac, is a part of, they're at a certain location, this farmhouse, which is a recreation, not an exact recreation, but it's sort of their version of the farmhouse from the original 1970s Texas Chainsaw Massacre film. And that's their sort of their lair, or however you say it, their hideout. That's their location, the evil castle in which they live. And anyone who comes nearby, they terrorize and maim and kill, and eventually seem to eat, because they're cannibals. Because they've got to be as crazy as can be. But they've got their reasons for eating people, because that's how they survive. And the prequel goes into that a little bit more, how the jobs are sort of dying out of town, and Leatherface actually worked at the what was it, the meat packing place, the slaughterhouse in town. And then so he, with the jobs sort of dying up, he's like, well, what can we do? We'll just feed on passers-by. So that's all interesting enough as a story element, that, okay, we're getting this information of where these characters are coming to be, the killers of tourists and passers-by that we know them to be. The problem is, though, is that being that it's a prequel, and being that all of the characters in this family that encounter in the beginning, I'm just going to keep calling it the beginning now, because Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning is a long thing to say, even for someone that speaks as insanely quick as me. In the beginning, all the characters that are in that family are the same exact characters as are in the remake, the 2003 remake that this is the prequel of. So, inherently that none of the bad guys die. Once again, it's the same kind of thing of plot immunity, except it's the bad guys having plot immunity. It's reversed. There's no characters in that family that aren't in the original, in the 2003 film. So it's not like, oh, why is that person not in the original? Why is that one not there? But they must get killed off, or maybe they escape or something. You don't know. There would be some uncertainty to the storytelling. It would create some uncertainty that would bring drama, and can allow for tension to occur. But because the only characters in that family in the prequel are the exact same ones in the 2003 original, that no harm really befalls them, except for the fact one of them is in a wheelchair, missing their legs in the 2003 film, and in the beginning, they have their legs, and then at a later point you see how they come to lose them. So there's that thing to occur. There's an injury, and this is something I'm going to come back upon, is that even if they don't die, there's an injury yet to that we see that's already occurred, that has yet to be inflicted. And it's this sort of thing that they seem to love to explore in a prequel, is, well, we're going to show how that injury occurs, as if it really matters how it occurred, because the information you gave us in the original story was sufficient. We didn't necessarily need to know. Our mind's eye could go down rabbit holes of imagination and conversation with other people about that film, about, well, how did this happen, or how did that happen? enough information was imparted, and all the prequel is doing is just colouring in ever so precisely exactly how that injury occurred. In this case, it's a guy in a wheelchair missing his legs, and 2 + 2 = 4. The chainsaw of the aforementioned film's name is a part of that process. So the good guys in this film are left in a very shitty situation. Being that the bad guys, the chainsaw family, are at the same location and it's the exact same group of people, we know for a fact that none of the bad guys die. The bad guys don't even have to shift locations based upon the events of this prequel. It's not like they're at a separate location to the 2003 film, and maybe whatever occurs in this film, the location they're currently at gets burnt down, or the authorities, the law, the cops find out about them, and then they have to go on the run, and then they hide in another place, which would be the place in the 2003 remake, No. They're in the same location, and it's the exact same people. So you know that nothing really happens to the bad guys whatsoever in this film. It's just about watching a few people, good guys, or the victims, whatever you want to call them, of this, I guess it's a slasher film, effectively, in a way. They all get picked off one by one, and there's no dramatic tension as to do any of them get away. The reason being that there's obviously none is because we know none of the bad guys get killed off. We know the bad guys don't even have to go on the run because of the events in this film, and that's how they end up in the place that they're in the 2003 one. It's the same location. Also, the fact that if they'd had to have got, they would have only had to have gone on the run if one of the people, at least one of or more of the people that are the good guys of this film, managed to get away and alert the authorities, which they clearly do not, because in the 2003 Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they're still right there living at that farmhouse, as happy as pigs and shit. So we're really watching nothing dramatically. There's zero tension. We're just watching gore unfold. And as much as you can say, oh yeah, but it's a part of all the fun of it, but there really is no... We're just watching events unfold with no drama to them whatsoever. We're just watching one train track get put in front of the other, but whereas normally in a story the train tracks behind it are being taken out or something, or you don't know which direction the train tracks are going. We know exactly where those train tracks are going. They're going towards a set of train tracks that have already been lined up, and we're just watching the one pile get, one post, or whatever you call it, get put in front of the other until there we go, now it's linked up. But we knew exactly where it was going. There was no tension. It's just about waiting to get to that point at the end of the film. And so, yeah, it really leaves it a bit lacking story-wise. And so, once again, plot immunity comes into it and kills the whole thing as far as storytelling. Except this time, as I said, it's the bad guys that have the plot immunity, as opposed to the prequel trilogy of Star Wars. It was the good guys that had the plot immunity. So, yeah, it's I give that one a very bad review as far as prequel status, because it really boxes in what the story can be, what can happen, whereas if they'd just done a sequel to the 2003 one, they would have had a lot more options, and you don't know what's going to happen to anyone. Now, for the next one, it's actually not a lot better either, but for different kind of reasons. But it's still, I give it just as much of a bad prequel review as Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning, is this little gem of a film, 2009's Underworld: Rise of the Lycans. The reason I picked this one is because it does something similar to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre prequel, but it's different. It's actually even worse in a way. Like it's worse in different ways. It's like they're trying to find all the worst ways that you could possibly do a prequel. Where Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning gave the bad guy characters plot immunity and just cornered in what the story could be, and how the good guys were just unable to do anything, and we knew that they were going to be unable to do anything. Underworld: Rise of the Lycans does this unique thing of stretching out a story that we've effectively already been told, whereas even the prequel of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is not exactly a story that we've been told, but we know how it's going to end based upon what we find at the beginning of the original. Rise of the Lycans, the third Underworld film, stretches out flashbacks that occur in the first film that tell a little story that complements the main story of the first Underworld film of ill-fated lovers, or not even necessarily ill-fated lovers, sort of more so in this one they're ill-fated lovers, but lovers from two different sides of a conflict almost. In Rise of the Lycans, it's a vampire woman and a werewolf man, and that story told in flashbacks in the original film helps complement the story of Kate Beckinsale's in that first film, in a similar romance that she's sort of getting into. But it's not exactly the same, and it doesn't unfold exactly the same. Her story, it unfolds a little bit differently to the one in the flashbacks, which is a bit more tragic. And this is what we're doing, is we're going back and exploring that tragedy, except they don't add anything new to the story. They literally just stretch out those flashbacks into like a 90 to 100 minute, however long it is, story, and tell that same story that the flashbacks told. They don't add any new complexities to the story that weren't told in those flashbacks just because they weren't important for the story of Underworld 1. But hey, now that we're exploring these flashbacks in their own story, we can get into those other complexities that were going on, and then we can dovetail off, with those in another series, like a sequel to Rise of the Lycans, like a Rise of the Lycans 2 that would dovetail off with other characters. No, that's not what they do. Everything is just about exploring that series of flashbacks, the story across them. So we've seen this story already, and all we're being shown is a more stretched out version of it. And once again, the details are just being painted in very specifically. Details that we already knew, but there was some ambiguity as to the X, Y, and Z of little in-betweens that didn't necessarily need to be told because they weren't going to add anything more to it. It was just stuff that didn't need to be told. It was like left up to the imagination of how did that, whatever. But with this, it wasn't even ambiguity that was, I think, even people questioned. Like, for example, something I'm going to go into later on. But in the case of the one I've already mentioned, Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the beginning, there's the guy in the wheelchair missing his legs in the 2003 one. And you wonder, well, how did he lose them? Did he get them chopped off by a chainsaw? I don't know exactly how that happened. Oh, I wonder how that happened. And then the beginning, the prequel, shows us that. Something that we didn't necessarily need to be shown. And it shows us that injury to occur. Rise of the Lycans shows us things that we had actually already been shown. And it just does it in a more stretched out way. So, yeah, it's I give it a very bad prequel review on that part. I might actually end up giving Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the beginning and Underworld Rise of the Lycans the worst prequel reviews that I could give, as far as it being a prequel, in its place in a franchise. Very similar, but kind of different reasons at the same time for those two films, for how the nature of them being prequels and how they've told their prequel story, because it wasn't that the story had to be this, it's what they've chosen the prequel that they're going to do ultimately come to pass to be. So yeah, it's a bit of a shitty one in my opinion, or a couple of shitty ones. Now, the fourth one is actually one that hasn't actually come out yet, and this is one that comes to tie in quite particularly with injuries that we've seen characters already bearing the people bearing injuries, and then this film looks like it'll probably quite potentially show at least one of them, maybe a couple, of how those injuries occurred. And that particular film being the prequel to Mad Max Fury Road, called Furiosa. Quite there, I found the comical picture of a bald Anya Taylor-Joy. Obviously she's not necessarily going to be bald in Furiosa, maybe, unless they shave her hair completely down. But she's playing the young Furiosa, because not that Charlize Theron was bald in that, but she did have short hair, so maybe they shave it down. You never know. It's a funny picture. Oh, are you laughing about a woman who's bald? No, it's just funny because for some reason when someone made a picture of Anya Taylor-Joy as Furiosa, they made her bald, which the character of Furiosa isn't bald in so it's not like they were matching her up to what the character is in the original story of Fury Road. But anyway, the Furiosa prequel, that's going to follow a similar train of thought where ultimately it's revealing details that we haven't seen yet. So it's not like Rise of the Lycans in that regard, but I feel like it's going to repeat similar mistakes as the Star Wars prequel trilogy and Rise of the Lycans, because it's following a character who we know survives to come to still be in another film, which is Fury Road, and given the nature of the universe that the story exists in, which is the first spin-off of a franchise that has otherwise followed just a singular character, which is Mad Max. It's not like this is a Star Wars film that is now not just called Star Wars Episode something, and now it's a spin-off following a particular person, and we don't know what happens with it because Star Wars is a big, large franchise that isn't just about one character in particular. Mad Max is about Mad Max. The same way that, James Bond is about James Bond. Yeah, it's following this one person. When you go back and do this prequel, it's quite clearly it's exploring Furiosa, and that's, for better or for worse, it's all that it's in all likelihood going to explore is Furiosa going forwards, because the thing, as I said earlier about with a prequel, like with the Star Wars prequel trilogy, is that what they could have done to bring some dramatic tension to it is to follow characters that weren't characters whose fates we knew, and you could include Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi and all these people that we know, and have their story be going through this story that we're following, but have all the dramatic tension rest upon people who we don't know if they live or die. But Furiosa, right from the get-go, the main character that we're following is a character who we know is alive in a later story, and they even survive in that story. But regardless or not they survived in that story, we know that they are still at least alive up until and into that story. So they've got to survive this story. So the only thing that we can really do to that character is the point that I was getting to before, which is injuries that they've yet to obtain. Her noticeably being, when does she lose her arm, which was something that I felt was quite great in Fury Road, was you didn't exactly know. They don't tell you out and out how that happens. You can come to your own conclusions of how that happens. Same as with the lead villain of that film, Immortan Joe. How does he come to need to wear that mask that he wears? We don't exactly know, but you can come to your own conclusions as to bits and pieces of it. But we didn't need to be exactly told the very specific details, which I'm sure her losing her arm is obviously going to be explored in this film, and Immortan Joe needing the mask may or may not be more explored in this film. It wouldn't surprise me if, to be honest, it is though. But it's things that we don't necessarily need to be told, and all they're doing is just going back in and colouring things in ever so more precisely, as opposed to seeing off somewhere in a direction. Oh, there's blue over here, for example. I'm saying there's blue over there. Over on the TV screen, there's blue, and we go, oh, there's blue, and all you know is it's blue, and that was all that was sufficient for you to know as far as your visual, your eyesight upon something. And then all they're doing now is going, look, there's aqua blue, there's baby blue, there's marine, there's a bit of this, and we didn't need to be told that, but just for the sake of money making or whatever, they're just colouring it in ever so more precisely. And also because of how this franchise of Mad Max has worked, the supporting characters of this prequel aren't going to be as important as, say, supporting characters could potentially be in another franchise like Star Wars, where you can keep having spin-offs of spin-offs, as there's one I'm going to get to that where there, a Star Wars film later on I'm going to get to, which has a spin-off of it, and it's a spin-off itself, and it has its own spin-off. Because it's the franchise itself isn't following just a singular character, it's following a world or a universe. But Mad Max as a franchise is following a character, which is the namesake of that franchise. And so doing a spin-off, you're now making quite a big step to go off and follow that character specifically. And so if you then try and follow other supporting characters around that person, are we actually going to then follow those people moving forwards after this story? And because if you do, at least there's some dramatic tension with those characters who's, if they're people that aren't in Fury Road, if they're not there in Fury Road, we can at least go, well, maybe because of how the world of Mad Max works, maybe they leave and escape, maybe they die, we don't know. At least with this film, there is potential for dramatic tension with some of the other surrounding characters. Not with the main character, but at least with a lot of the surrounding characters. But there are some characters showing up in it. The lead character, one of the lead villains, which is a Morton Joe, but he's not the only lead villain. What do you call them? And then some of the supporting characters around in it, like at least a couple of other the bad guys, like the Doof Warrior and one of the sons of a Morton Joe, are in Fury Road. So we know that they're not going to die in this film. So some of the characters in this film have plot immunity. But there are some characters that show up in it, good and bad, that aren't in Fury Road. So maybe they die in this, or maybe they escape. There's at least ambiguity there, and that can create tension and good drama, because we don't know what becomes of them going into the story. By the end of the film we'll know, but not at the start. We're not sitting down and already knowing. Our subconscious isn't mapping out going, well, we know that that person's not there, or this has to come to pass in X, Y, and Z. But our brains are already making conclusions that can only be this way or that way. But at least there's still some choices that the narrative can take and leave us on the edge of our seats. But the supporting characters in this, I don't feel like are going to be too, important moving forwards in the franchise overall. Even if they do escape the events of Furiosa, are we really going to then follow them? I can't really see that happening. Maybe not. Maybe they do. But I can't really see that coming to pass because of how this franchise has been centered, as I said, around a singular character. Because that's what it's about. It's about Mad Max. And then splintering off to follow... Hang on, I need a drink. Oh, all that talking. Yeah. Splintering off to follow, a character. It has to be a character of quite some importance. Furiosa being a character that can measure up to that level of importance, because she's actually another road warrior, like Max is. But this isn't just a franchise that they splinter off and follow every other character, because there's already been multiple other characters throughout the Mad Max series that they could have followed. They could have done a spin-off about the feral kid from Road Warrior, all sorts of people, or the kids from Beyond Thunderdome, or someone from the first movie or something. There's a lot of different turning points they could have taken, but Furiosa is a point where we go, yeah, she's actually quite big as a character. We could do a spin-off about her, but they've chosen to do a prequel. I feel like they should have chosen to do a sequel. I feel like that's the mistake they've made, is that they should have moved forwards with her story following Fury Road, and then that would also create more dramatic tension, because does she live? Does she die? We don't know. We don't know how this is going to turn out. This is a new franchise. This is a spin-off of a franchise. We don't know what's going to become of her and all the people around her, because they might come to still be in a sequel of that film, of that sequel, so they might be in, when they do a sequel to, if they did a Furiosa spin-off that was a sequel, and then a character or two around her survives that film, they might be in the sequel and live, or they might die in that, or they might not, There's uncertainty, and once again, dramatic tension can be made. Because George Miller, the writer and director of the other four, the four Mad Max films in this universe, though, because he's writing and directing this one, I'm sure it's going to be a great, this is why I'd make the distinction of how I rate it as a prequel. I'm sure it's going to be of great quality, because films like, for example, Underworld Rise of the Lycans wasn't directed by the same person as the first two. So there's a notable absence that film had, that prequel had, that the other ones didn't. The Star Wars prequel trilogy was written and directed by George Lucas, who wrote and effectively kind of directed all the originals. He made them, effectively. He might have had a director step in on set for Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, but he was effectively in charge of those films. He decided what they were going to be. So as good as I'm sure it's going to be, like in terms of its quality and visual action scenes and everything, and just the look of it, there's a little bit of dramatic tension that's lost because of that. But it's not the worst in terms of how much has been sapped out of it. It's got potential for still a lot of drama there. But it's going to do that thing. It's going to be one of the worst films, I feel, for as obviously exploring injuries that are yet to part, that we've already seen the after effects of, and we're just going to show this is how this occurred, this is how that occurred, this is how that bit occurred. Right, this is how Darth Vader ended up in the suit. You know, this is going to be the almost maybe the mother of all prequels, I think, for that kind of thing. For this is how that person got that mask, this is how that person lost their arm, and yeah, and so on and so forth. Now, as much bashing as I've done of prequels, and I'm not exactly over with the bashing, but I'm almost entirely over with the bashing, I actually want to bring up some exceptions for prequels where, you know, because a prequel isn't just a bad story in itself, it's just a story that has to be very carefully told. And you can do a good prequel. And the irony is that some franchises include the worst, or what I would dub some of the worst and some of the best prequel work ever done. Star Wars being one of those. The example that I'm now about to present being Rogue One, which is obviously a very direct prequel to the original Star Wars film. And this, I feel, does a prequel justice, like in terms of how you tell a prequel story. It follows a group of characters whose fates we're not aware of because they're not in the original trilogy or any other Star Wars films that chronologically take place after this film. Now, that could be because they die in this film, or it could be because their adventure continues on after this film and takes place alongside other films and just doesn't directly tie into them, or maybe it's around them and we see events that occur in those films are because of the characters in Rogue One afterwards. We don't know. Obviously, Rogue One, the characters actually all do die, but we don't know that at the start of the film because we don't know for certain what their fates are. So there's an uncertainty to that. Whereas something like the point of difference being, you know, Padme Amidala in the Star Wars prequel trilogy, she's not in the original trilogy, but we know for a fact that because of who she is, she's the mother of Luke and Leia, and she's the, you know, the romantic love interest of Anakin Skywalker, aka Darth Vader, that if she was alive, she certainly would have been involved in the events of the original trilogy. Whereas the characters in Rogue One, they're not necessarily characters that would have been involved in the events of the original trilogy, like with Luke, Han, and Leia. They could have been off doing other things in the Rebel Alliance, or not even been a part of the Rebel Alliance. You don't know. So there's dramatic tension there. There's ambiguity, once again. These key words that are, you know, the word of today on Sesame Street, Big Bird, is ambiguity. But something they even did very smartly when they made that film of Rogue One was they had the lead actress, Felicity Jones, sign up in her contract for a sequel. The idea being that, oh yes, to the outsiders who are able to get this information in the sneaky ways that they seem to be able to do nowadays, through the internet and all the joys that can bring, they wrote into her contract that she'll be signed up for a sequel. So people would see that contract, find out that in her contract she signed up for a sequel, and think, okay, this is her franchise. This is a spin-off thing that's going to follow her moving forwards. Whether or not the other people live or die, we don't know, but it's following her. The big twist actually being, no, even she dies. Everyone dies. It's almost a bit of an Inglourious Bastards and Star Wars kind of thing, where not that everyone dies in that movie, Inglourious Bastards, but almost everyone does. They all kind of go down fighting the good fight. Yeah, and I feel like that's how you do a prequel. Especially the fact that it's not the fact that it's not following, it's not just primarily following characters who are in the original film or films. It's following characters who aren't even in that. And even most of the characters that do, when they do show up, original characters, they're not like Darth Vader or Tarkin or Mon Mothma, you know, Darth Vader and Tarkin being on the bad side and Mon Mothma being on the good side. They're not even the the lead bad guy of Rogue One or an important lead good guy of this film. They're just background ancillary characters. Like Darth Vader isn't the lead of this film the way that he's not the lead villain of this film the way that Adolf Hitler isn't really the lead villain of Inglourious Basterds. They do obviously kill him and then take him down. There's the effort for that because he's Adolf Hitler. You got to do what you got to do. But they don't make Darth Vader the central villain. It's actually the guy who's played by Ben Mendelsohn who's trying to get the Death Star built. He's the guy that's the villain of this film because he's the villain to Felicity Jones, the same way that the Christoph Waltz character of Hans Landa is the villain in Inglourious Basterds to the bastards themselves, and especially to the young Jewish girl of Shoshana, because in the context of that story, he's her ultimate villain, essentially, in a way. So that the original characters that do show up, they actually are relegated to these kind of supporting background roles where they take part in certain things, but all the dramatic tension scenes or whatever aren't being thrust upon them, which in the Star Wars prequel trilogy they were. Anakin Skywalker had a lot of, and as well as Obi-Wan Kenobi, even more so than Anakin, had a lot of dramatic tension placed upon them, or supposed dramatic tension, of are they going to die in this action scene, or are they going to live? Are they going to die? Oh, they lived. Yeah, we know they're going to live because they're in the original films. Rogue One did all of this right, at least in my opinion. But, you know, as far as I'm concerned, my opinion is the right one. No, it's not the right one, but it's right to me, you know what I mean? But everyone has their different opinions, and this is just my opinions of prequels. And as much as you can, you know, like it or not like a prequel story, as far as it being a movie, you can have a very different opinion of it as a prequel, which, you know, I love Rogue One as a movie, and I love it as a prequel. I love the Star Wars prequel trilogy, but I don't really like them as prequels, as far as that narrative storytelling conceit. Now, the next one that I'm going to mention is a similar kind of conceit of how you should do a prequel, but almost even more so how you should do it in a way, like in terms of to get as much possible dramatic tension out of it, whilst having it still be in a franchise, by having it be a prequel but be as disconnected as possible from the original, but still be, it's that tightrope of still being connected whilst being as disconnected as possible, so everything that takes place in this movie can still be up for grabs. But this movie I'm about to mention has a very particular conceit in it that I haven't seen a lot of other prequels end on. And that prequel is Prey. The I think it's 300-year prior prequel to Predator. Now, the story in this obviously has nothing to do with any of the characters from the original Predator films, whether it's human or predators themselves. And I feel like I actually quite enjoyed this film just as a film. I thought it was really quite well done. But there's a very interesting conceit that I mentioned, which happens in this film, which is the thing I kind of want to talk about it for, which is how the film ends. Is that it's not right at the end that she gets this, but the main character of this film is a young girl called Naru, a Native American or Indian, however you want to call them, girl. And I think it's a flintlock pistol that she gets. I think flintlock is the type of technology that it is. It's a little musket pistol, basically. We'll just call it the musket pistol. Now, it seems to be indicated in this film, from the way they sort of deal with it and the way it looks and everything, that it's the very same musket pistol that Danny Glover's character of Harrigan in the second Predator is given at the end of that film by when he's fighting a predator across the events of Predator 2, and at the end of that film, when he kills that predator on its spaceship, off comes the stealth cloaking technology of a few other predators that were nearby watching Danny Glover and this other predator fight, and Danny Glover win that fight. And one of those predators that was watching the fight from just a short distance away gives Danny Glover a little musket pistol as a souvenir. And what that did back in the day of when we were watching that film, it showed us that, okay, some of these predators are probably actually kind of old, you know, like they're actually not, they can maybe even age potentially a lot longer than humans can. But also the fact, even if whether they do or not, it sort of brought that potential up. but also the idea that even if it's not that these predators live a lot longer than humans, or can live a lot longer as long as they don't die on a hunt, that they've been coming and going to Earth for a long period of time for them to obviously have obtained this musket pistol. Now, when Danny Glover was given that musket pistol at the end of Predator 2, that was essentially all the questions that were raised by that was, oh wow, this awareness of they've been coming and going to Earth for quite some time. But in this prequel story of Prey, this girl, Naru, survives and she kills the predator that's hunting her and other people down in this film. But what happens though is, by connecting her with this musket pistol and leaving her with it, it establishes this weird crossover point of what becomes of her because of this musket pistol, because of how predators tend to obtain things like that. They only tend to obtain instruments or objects like that through the things that they kill. And so it brings up these potentials for what have this weird endpoint for that we're left with this character in terms of she survives this story, but something must happen to her between the events of Prey, which is in I think the 1700s thereabouts, and the events of Predator 1 and 2, or like the events of Predator 2 where Danny Glover gets given that musket pistol. Because she eventually becomes the prey of either the predator from the end of Predator 2, as I said, if they can live for long periods of time, and maybe when it's younger it goes and kills her. Maybe it's the first kill that it gets, or maybe it's just one of the things it hunts, and it gets the musket pistol off her. Or B, another predator in turn gets the gun from her, kills her and takes the gun from her, and then the predator from the end of Predator 2 eventually comes into possession of that gun through just a series of, you keep what you kill, you keep what you kill. Or C, Naru eventually, probably the most unlikely one, I think if she does get killed by this, which sort of seems to be that something takes it from her, she gets killed by another human or humans, and then eventually they get it taken from them by a predator. I reckon more likely it would be a predator of some sort that takes it from her, but it leaves this weird thing up in the air at the end of this film. And it's kind of an interesting note for a prequel to do because it raises questions and it brings about a bit of dramatic tension, which is something that not a lot of prequels actually tend to do. It actually leaves this interesting thread in between the prequel and the original films, which not every prequel tends to do. A lot of prequels tend to try and tie a nice little neat bow into, this is how this one slips into the original. Like Rogue One, for example, because of when it takes place, it ties exactly into the original film. The film of Prey gives us this interesting little, what happens in between, and then we're left to wonder, and questions can be asked, and then conversation can occur between people. And that's something great that films can do, like in Blade Runner, for example, the original Blade Runner, where is Harrison Ford a replicant or is he not? We don't know. Questions, conversations can come about from that. And that's what made one of the things that made the film great. Now, in keeping with the horror sci-fi of it all, I'm sticking with that for the next film, which is a couple of films, the first of which being Prometheus. Prometheus does a similar thing to Prey, except because the alien films take place far in the future, even when you go back in time a few decades or a bunch of decades, you're still in the far off future where spaceships and all of this sort of stuff, of space travel and everything can occur and exist and be kind of normal. And in Prometheus, and Prometheus and Alien Covenant, because I'm talking essentially about both of them at the same time, they're following completely different characters in completely different locations, whilst teasing that they're leading towards an almost Rogue One style establishing of events that begin the original Alien film, because that's sort of what, even though it's a bit of an unfinished series, the Prometheus Alien Covenant series, there was meant to be, they were originally going to, I think, do 2 more, and then they were apparently going to do just 1 more. Alien Awakening, I think, was the title they were going to call it. It might not end up even happening, or that might not even end up being the title if it does come to pass. But it was this series that was following a series of events that were seemed to be leading towards, from what we were being told and what we were being shown, that it was going to show how that spaceship that the Sigourney Weaver character of Ripley finds how it comes to exist on that planet of LV-426, on the original Alien, that her Sigourney Weaver's spaceship and all her crew come and find it and get into trouble. And then how that whole series unfolds based upon just her finding it, and then one thing leads to another, one thing leads to another. But following such a separate group of characters at an earlier point in time, there was dramatic tension. There was the possibility of what happens to these people. We don't know. They might live, they might die. We don't know. There was ambiguity there, and thus that creates drama, good drama, of, we don't know what's going to happen to these people at the start of a film. We've got to watch until the end of the film. We've got to hear the whole story be told and played out before we know. But it also was doing this interesting thing of tiptoeing in a, almost a multiple story kind of way, doing what Rogue One did in one film, where it's connecting up to this original film, but it was taking a few films to do it, and we're going, oh, how this is going to come to be, and eventually we're going to see that we're going to see that thing happen. We're going to see the aftermath of that thing, of that crashed spaceship full of alien eggs, and maybe the final film ends with that crashed spaceship full of alien eggs, and then we cut to X amount of years later, and Sigourney Weaver's spaceship comes landing down, and boom, that's it. It might not tie in as much of a Rogue One minutes before kind of way, but it was leading in a similar fashion. But I felt like Prometheus and Rogue One were doing a great thing, though, of distancing themselves enough, providing characters whose fates we didn't know, what, if they live or die, and telling us a story that was familiar, but also, just giving us enough distance and potential for, edge of your seat entertainment. So it was another one that I felt, did it right, effectively. And you can think what you can of those films, for better or for worse. I quite like both of them. Obviously, Alien Covenant, the second one, is a bit more, it's actually called Alien something, and it's a bit more like an alien film. Prometheus is a little bit more, it's leading towards it, and that's cool. I like it for that as well. But they do their own thing, and they're not, I enjoyed them. I thought they were good as movies and as prequels. They hit both boxes for me. Now, getting towards the end of what's been quite a big rant about prequels, I'm going to actually explore another. I'm exploring now kind of a quadrilogy, obviously just all at once. So we had the trilogy of Star Wars to start off with, and we're going to end on a quadrilogy. And once again, funnily enough, it's a series of prequels that has Michael Fassbender in them. This series being, if you haven't guessed it already, by the fact of prequels with Michael Fassbender, is the X-Men prequels. Starting with X-Men First Class, then carrying on into Days of Future Past, then Apocalypse, and then Dark Phoenix. And these four films, as far as movie quality, they did sort of seem to go up and down kind of thing, and movie quality. But as far as prequels, I would give them a little bit of a... This is where my prequel bashing wasn't entirely over. They're not the worst for it, but they're basically following a bunch of characters, like quite a few characters whose fates we already know, because most of these characters are alive in the X-Men original trilogy. So once again, we're following people whose fates we know. They don't die in these films. Even though in the second one, Days of Future Past, some time travel shenanigans occurs that kind of changes things a little bit. And so, it's not exactly taking place like how it occurred before, but ultimately the same things all seem to end up linking into place, that no matter how much you try to change fate, it still sort of ends up the same. Which is a bit of a buzzkill for dramatic tension, as I've droned on about through these previous films. They detail events that we haven't seen, and they map out injuries, like I said before, such as Charles Xavier's need for being a wheelchair. Injuries that already exist, but they're not things that we needed to see, but they're detailing it, they're showing events that we haven't seen, and and just filling in details that we didn't exactly need to know about characters that we've already so I give them a little bit of a bad review, because too much of the dramatic tension was placed upon the characters that we already knew from the original films, as opposed to having them be supporting characters like Rogue One did, where you could have had Professor X and Magneto be in these films, and then maybe even only have them mainly be in the first one as the lead characters, and then sort of have them be supporting characters and follow some other people, and really just follow those people's stories, people who aren't in the original trilogy, and we don't know why they're not in it or not. You could have created more tension that way. But instead, we're once again following characters that we know at least live up to this film, or maybe they survive all of them. So, Michael Fassbender, once again, getting himself into the prequel arena, kind of simultaneous as he's doing the Prometheus and Alien Covenant films. It's funny how people are like, I think Woody Harrelson's like this. He's called the sequel guy. Michael Fassbender should be called the prequel guy. There we go. I should copyright that. I don't know if I can. Not really. Don't care. But anyway, that's just my thoughts and feelings on different kinds of prequels out there in the world. Some films that are sort of worse for being a prequel in terms of how they've sort of cornered their story because of how they've chosen to do their prequel, or other ones that they either shouldn't have been a prequel, or if they did do it as a prequel, that it was very particular how they could have done it while still having a dramatically interesting story. Some of them did do it quite well as far as drama, like Rogue One and Prey, but then you get other ones like the Star Wars prequel trilogy, or Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning, or Underworld: Rise of the Lycans, or the lastly mentioned X-Men prequel quadrilogy, where we know what's going to happen. There's no sort of uncertainty whatsoever. It's not, do they go this way or this way, and there's just a two choice of do they live or die. Maybe we don't know, but at the end of the film we will. So that there's at least the drama of this film to occur. We know what's going to happen. So different positives, different negatives, different sins, different miracles of the prequel world. I've got some honourable mentions now as well that are I'm not going to go into as much detail about or drone on about, because I've droned on about prequels for long enough, almost losing my voice in the process. As much as I think I can talk, I even have a limit break, at that. But just quickly, I'll go over some of the honourable mentions. Is the recent movie Pearl, which was a prequel to the film X. Once again, it was I thought it was a very good film, but when it comes down to the prequel side of it, it's just because it is what it is. It's following a specific character it's called Pearl, which is the name of a character from the film X. It's following a character who is in that original film, so whether or not they live, I know what happens to them in the original film, but whether or not they live or die in the original film, that they at least make it to the original film. So in this film, nothing really happens to them of any dramatic concern. So it's just about unfolding events and waiting for them to get to the point that to quote the prequel trilogy of Star Wars, waiting for them to get into the Darth Vader suit. That's all we're really doing, is just watching the minutes tick by until they get into the Darth Vader suit, so to speak. Other honourable mentions are I think it's 2011 it came out, it's called The Thing, which was the same name as the movie that it's a prequel of, which is The Thing, or John Carpenter's The Thing, but really John Carpenter's just the director, and he would just attach his name to the front of it, so it's The Thing. This film was quite good and bad in both two different ways, because it had the potential to be quite good, and I think when they filmed it, they actually had a lot of practical set effects, but then they went with a lot of digital effects after the fact in post-production, which is quite juxtaposed to what the original film, which is quite notoriously famous for the practical effects that are in that film, of monster transformations and so on and so forth. But it's bad for the effects, I would argue, in terms of there's a lot of digital stuff going on, which I felt was a mistake. I think that's something a lot of people mention with that film. But that's just about it being a movie. As far as the prequel side of it goes, which is why I'm mentioning it, as far as a movie as well, it also sort of doesn't have the pacing of the original film. It's a bit too roller coastery. It doesn't have the drawn out tension of the so not just even as far as dramatic tension that a prequel can take away from a film. Just the pacing of this film removes a lot of tension from it that the original film has because of the drawn out nature of the story in it. But as far as the prequel side of it goes, it's following a group of people whose fates we all essentially know. And as interesting as it can be to follow that, because it's a very specifically famous kind of group of people that precede the original film. It's the Norwegian camp who, when the Kurt Russell character and one or two other people go and see this place in the original film, it's already all burnt down and there's a bunch of dead bodies all burnt and destroyed and cut apart and everything. There's obviously been quite an interesting... There's been another movie that's occurred there. But it's the idea that made it so cool is that we haven't seen that movie, and that's what made it cool, was that you don't get to see that movie. It's a movie that occurred before this movie, but now by in process of showing that movie as a prequel, it's not really as good as what the idea of it was. The actual movie itself doesn't really amount up to as much as that sort of the imagination that we could just let run loose by the bits and pieces of the aftermath that we see in the original film. And I think it suffered for that. It's never gonna chalk up to what, you know, the possibilities of it could be. Then another honourable mention I have is the movie The King's Man. So there was the movie The Kingsman, called The Kingsman Secret Service, I think, and The Kingsman Golden Circle. And then there's this movie, The King's Man, which is the third in the franchise. Another third movie, which is a prequel. It's an interesting point as well. When they make a third one, they decide to make it a prequel sometimes, like with Underworld. But The King's Man is set in World War One, so it's set quite a number of years prior to the original films. So none of the characters in this are actually in the first two films. So there's some dramatic potential there for what happens to them, and they actually do. Some of the people survive. Some of the people actually get killed off, and you're like, wow, I thought some things like that it did quite well. Come on, got to make it to the end. Can't lose your voice just yet. But yeah, it how do I put it? It did that quite well, of leaving us on the edge of our seat. Well, will this person live? Will they die? Not the greatest movie I've ever seen, but it had some very interesting action in it. It told quite an interesting story, sort of in a before and during and to the end of World War One. And it actually had, as far as prequels go, it actually had some, you know, some drama to it, you know, as far as what's going to happen. Also, moving on, in the next one for honourable mentions is not a movie, but actually a TV show, House of the Dragon. Hasn't finished yet. We've seen one season at this point in time. There's still at least one more season going to come along, depending how long they want to draw the story out. And that's another thing about drawing out a story, like how long you stretch it out for. But I feel like thus far they've been doing quite well, because it takes place a couple of 100 years before the original story. So all the characters in it aren't characters in the original story of Game of Thrones. So we don't know what exactly happens to them. There are the books, though, to go back and look at. They might not exactly follow the books. They seem to roughly be doing that, though. But once again, it takes place so long before it that you don't know exactly what happens to the people. If you're only following the TV shows, you don't know what's going to happen to these people. So I like it for that regard. It's great. I thought it was a well-done TV show as far as just the product itself, the quality of it. And then as far as a prequel story goes, it's doing good. And a quick little bad mention, just to finish it off, just to, you know, maybe try and provide a nice little sort of comedy end cap to this, is another story like a prequel like Furiosa that's hasn't come out yet, but it's a prequel that's nonetheless on its way, is a prequel to a little known film called The Lion King. Now, this prequel, I believe, is preceding the Disney. It's not that it's really live action, but the more recent Lion King film, you know, the remake, I should say, of Lion King, and it's going to be a prequel to that called Mufasa. Now, this film is almost one of the worst for this, because it's preceding a film, you know, it's following a character whose fate we know. Mufasa, we obviously quite sadly know what the fate of Mufasa is. And, because he dies in the original film. So we're following the fate of a character whose fate we already know. And then what more are you really going to tell us? And not that Lion King's a simplistic thing, but it sort of is in a way, of father, son, the circle of life, all those things that it's talking about. What more are you going to add to that, really, again, by just going back and doing a prequel based upon this character? Because as good as you want to make it, or as upbeat as you want to make it, ultimately it's going to end on this point of knowing that this character's leading towards quite a tragic death. There's a song in the original Lion King film of "I just can't wait to be king," and not that they're going to do this, but what's Mufasa going to sing? I just can't wait to get fucking trampled to death. It's leading towards a tragedy, and it's a prequel that I don't really feel like we need, and it's not really going to be that positive of a note of a film. So I'll leave you with that. A nice little bit of food for thought there on a much beloved classic that they're probably going to bastardize. And I will see you all when I see you. Until next time.